Chinese scientists boarded a cargo plane. They were carrying over 1 billion mosquitoes, not to attack anyone, not as a weapon. They called it a solution, a biological fix for one of the world's deadliest problems. The plan was precise. The science was real. The approval was signed. And for the first 48 hours, everything worked exactly as they said it would. Then came hour 72, and nothing worked the way anyone expected. Field researchers stopped sending updates. Monitoring stations in the Western Amazon went quiet, and 3 lead scientists on the project quietly requested emergency meetings with government officials in Beijing. The public heard nothing. For weeks, nothing. But the data existed, the field reports existed, and a few of them leaked. What those reports described wasn't a conspiracy. It wasn't a cover-up in the Hollywood sense. It was something quieter and somehow more unsettling. A real experiment, a real result, and a response that raised more questions than it answered. This is the story of what happened when one of the most ambitious mosquito release programs in modern history met the complexity of the Amazon rainforest, and why the scientists who designed it never expected what came next. To understand what went wrong, you have to understand why it started. The Amazon has a mosquito problem, not just any problem, a crisis. Millions of people living in river communities across Brazil, Peru, and Colombia had been battling malaria, dengue, and yellow fever for decades. Local health systems were overwhelmed. International aid was slow, and the mosquitoes kept winning. That's when a team of researchers from Guangzhou, one of China's most advanced insect research centers, proposed something bold. They had already done it at home. In Guangzhou, they had released sterile male mosquitoes into urban neighborhoods, males infected with a bacteria called Wolbachia, males that couldn't produce surviving offspring. The local mosquito population collapsed by over 90%. It worked. The data was clean. The results were published. So the question became simple in their minds. Why not scale it? Why not take this proven method and apply it somewhere that needed it most? They approached Brazilian environmental authorities. They ran the proposal through international health organizations. They gathered approvals, signatures, and endorsements. Everything looked right on paper. What they didn't fully account for was the difference between a controlled city grid in southern China and 5.5 million square kilometers of living, breathing, unmapped jungle. The Amazon isn't a neighborhood. It doesn't follow models. And the mosquitoes there had been evolving for millions of years before any laboratory ever existed. The release team landed at a small airstrip near Manaus. They unloaded the containers, and on a humid morning, they opened them. 1 billion sterile males rose into the canopy, and at first, the data looked perfect. But somewhere in that jungle, something was already adapting. The first 48 hours were extraordinary. Trap counts dropped. Bite rates in nearby river villages fell noticeably. Local health workers were sending positive reports back to Manaus. The lead researcher, Dr. Chen Wei, called it the most promising field result he had seen in 15 years of work. He was proud. His team was proud. And that pride lasted exactly 2 more days. On hour 72, a field monitor stationed near the Rio Negro tributary sent an unusual note. Not an alarm, just a question. He had noticed that the sterile males being tracked by wing-beat sensors weren't staying in the release zones. They were moving, not drifting, not scattering randomly the way the models predicted. They were moving together, in patterns, deeper into the jungle. Dr. Chen reviewed the telemetry data himself. He assumed sensor error. He recalibrated the equipment. The data said the same thing. Then the second report came in, from a monitoring post 40 kilometers away from the release site. A post that should have been completely outside the dispersal range. It was registering mosquito activity. Not just any mosquitoes, tagged ones, the ones they had released. A species that was only supposed to survive days in the wild was showing up far beyond any boundary the team had mapped. Dr. Chen sat with his field coordinator that evening by a generator-lit table in the base camp. He didn't speak for a long time. Then he said something his coordinator would later describe in a leaked internal memo. He said, "The Wolbachia may have transferred." His coordinator didn't fully understand what that meant at that moment. But Dr. Chen did, and the look on his face said everything. Wolbachia is not a toxin. It is not a virus in the traditional sense. It is a bacteria, one that lives inside insect cells and spreads naturally through reproduction. In a controlled environment, it is remarkably useful. In an uncontrolled one, it behaves like something entirely different. What Dr. Chen feared was this. The sterile males weren't just moving beyond their zone, they were making contact with wild native mosquito populations in the deep jungle. And Wolbachia has a known ability to jump species under certain conditions. It had happened in laboratories before, quietly, in controlled settings where it was manageable. But out here, in one of the most biodiverse ecosystems on the planet, the variables were impossible to count. Dr. Chen filed an internal alert that night. He requested a pause on the program. The request took 4 days to reach the right desk in Beijing. 4 days during which the tagged mosquitoes kept moving. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the villages. A community health worker near the town of Barcelos reported a strange observation to local Brazilian health authorities. He had noticed a new mosquito species in the area, one he had never seen before in 30 years of living along that river. He described it as slightly larger than the common Culex mosquito, unusual wing pattern, and unusually aggressive biting behavior for the time of day. His report was logged, filed, and initially dismissed as misidentification. But he sent photographs, and when those photographs eventually reached a Brazilian entomologist at the University of Manaus, the scientist went very quiet. Because what he saw in those images wasn't a known species from that region. It wasn't supposed to be there at all. The entomologist's name was Dr. Marcos Almeida. He had spent 20 years cataloging insect species across the Amazon basin. He knew every common mosquito in that region by sight. And what he was looking at in those photographs was not common. He cross-referenced the images against every regional database he had access to. No match. He contacted a colleague at Brazil's National Tropical Disease Institute in Brasilia. That colleague made 3 calls the same afternoon. By the next morning, a small federal team was quietly dispatched to Barcelos. No press release, no public announcement. Just a van, some equipment, and instructions to collect samples. What they found in the field confirmed what the photographs suggested. A hybrid population had emerged, not a monster, not something from a science fiction film, something far more scientifically unsettling. The Wolbachia bacteria, introduced through the released sterile males, had transferred into a native Amazonian mosquito species, one with a completely different biology, a wider habitat range, and a far stronger resistance to environmental stress. The sterile males were supposed to die without reproducing, and they did. But the bacteria inside them didn't. It had found a new host, a stronger one, and that host was now carrying it across river systems and deep canopy zones that no monitoring station could reach. Dr. Almeida sent a formal report to the Brazilian Ministry of Health. He used careful scientific language, but one line in that report stood out to every official who read it. He wrote, "We are no longer tracking the original experiment." He paused, then added 4 words that nobody in that room was ready for. "We are tracking something new." The meetings that followed happened behind closed doors. Brazilian federal officials, Chinese embassy representatives, a quiet delegation from the World Health Organization. No joint press conference, no shared statement, just silence, and carefully worded denials that answered nothing. Dr. Chen Wei was recalled to Beijing within the week. His team packed up the base camp near Manaus in less than 48 hours. The monitoring equipment was removed, the field stations were closed, and the data from the operation was classified under a bilateral research confidentiality agreement that neither government has publicly acknowledged since. Dr. Almeida continued his work independently. He submitted 2 follow-up reports to the Ministry of Health over the next several months. Both were acknowledged. Neither received a formal response. He kept collecting samples anyway. And what those samples showed was not catastrophic, not an epidemic, not a collapse. But it was a change. The hybrid mosquito population had stabilized in certain river zones. It wasn't spreading uncontrollably, but it wasn't disappearing either. It had simply become part of the ecosystem now, an unplanned addition to one of the most complex biological systems on Earth, and nobody officially knows it is there. That is perhaps the most unsettling part of this entire story. Not that the experiment failed. Experiments fail. Science expects that. The unsettling part is that something was introduced into the Amazon at a massive scale. It behaved in ways nobody predicted, and the official response was to quietly close the file. The jungle absorbed it, and the jungle kept no record. But the data exists, somewhere. And now, so does something that wasn't there before. If stories like this make you think differently about the world, you are exactly who this channel is made for. Subscribe, because the next story is already waiting.